Okay, hi, good evening everyone. Sorry for the delay, that's completely my fault. We had a hard time figuring out how the mics work. My name is Dr. Warren Doctor. I'm the President and CEO of the East Tennessee Historical Society. So first I just want to thank you all for coming out tonight to hear our talks. Give yourself a big round of applause. Especially for coming out on such a hot day. It has been very hot. I also wanted to just take a moment to thank the staff who helped put this together. Gang Lyons, Kelly, Weatherly, Sinclair, Jackson, and Sequoia were here. Tim has been instrumental in bringing over the books and helping get everything into place, so I just want to thank them. And I would also just like to say, if you're not a member of the East Tennessee Historical Society, we would love for you to join so we can continue to host talks like this and bring these fantastic speakers into Knoxville. I'm contractually obligated to say that. I also just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we're standing on historical ground. This church is from the Revolutionary era, though not this building specifically. And if you have been to the graveyard here, you will know that there are many patriots buried here. So this is hallowed ground in a way, and I couldn't think of a more appropriate place for us to host such an amazing and eminent historian whose own works affected my own research on Winston Churchill. He's a fantastic military historian, but I'm not here to introduce him. I'm actually here to introduce one of our past presidents and a very dear friend of mine who was instrumental in bringing in this great speaker. He's a friend, and I should also say he's a bit of an inspiration, kind of a hero. But without further ado, I'm going to turn over to the Honorable Jerome Melson.
So he's actually saying honorable because I'm a judge, but tonight I'm simply an enthusiastic reader, along with all of you. We are, of course, on historic ground as well as holy ground. Outside, a scant distance away from us, are reposed mortal remains of a number of Revolutionary War era soldiers whose supreme sacrifice helped, of course, create this wonderful nation in which we live, and whose 250th birthday we shall soon celebrate. We also have outside, in addition to those soldiers, buried in the cemetery is William Blount, along with his wife. And William Blount's signature, of course, adorns the United States Constitution, one of our, of course, founding documents, and he being one of our founding fathers. In addition, of course, to thanking all of you for the effort you've undertaken to come here on a Monday evening, I want to remember to thank Reverend Mark Curtis and all of those in the leadership here at First Presbyterian Church for their hospitality in opening this sanctuary to us to give a special venue in order for us to examine with the contribution of this eminent historian the founding of our great nation. I had the opportunity to become acquainted with Rick some number of years ago during a time that he was concluding a celebrated trilogy on the liberation of Europe in World War II, which, of course, its first volume resulted in him receiving what I think was one of 3 Pulitzer prizes that he has been celebrated for. And I want to tell you that as I consider how do you introduce somebody of that level of accomplishment, and when one reads the jacket words or one reads in some of the national press these book reviews from eminent literary and historical figures, one realizes you can scarcely contribute anything much beyond what has already been said. Reminds me, however, of what a privilege it is to read good history, and what a noble calling it is to those who bring the stories of our rich past to life, and do so with eloquence, with insight, and with wisdom. And Rick is, of course, among a very elite number of people who are doing this here on the contemporary scene. Anthony Trollope, a Victorian novelist and a post office reformer, of all things, a civil servant, somewhat like myself, said this: "This habit of reading, I make bold to tell you, is your path to the greatest, the purest, and the most perfect pleasure that God has prepared for his creatures. It lasts when all other pleasures fade. It will support you when all other recreations are gone. It will last until your death. It will make your hours pleasant to you as long as you live. What a privilege it is for me to join you in warmly welcoming a man who has given us all many wonderful, pleasant hours of reading. Ladies and gentlemen, Rick Atkinson.
There you go. Thank you. Well, thank you for that, Jerome, my friend. Thank you all for coming out on Monday night. I'm very pleased to be here in one of the most interesting towns in the country. I've been in hundreds of them, and there's none more interesting than this one. I'm here to talk about our national origin story this evening. We're just beginning the commemoration of the semi-quincentennial, which sounds like a medical procedure. But it's actually a 50-cent word for the 250th anniversary of this country's founding. And like the bicentennial 5 decades ago, and I'm old enough to remember it well, it's an opportunity for celebration, but also reflection about who we are, where we came from, what our forebears believed, and what they were willing to die for, which is the most profound question any people can ask themselves. I'll talk for a bit, and then we'll open it up to your questions and your comments in the hopes of having a conversation, not just a lecture. So this new book of mine, The Fate of the Day, is fundamentally about those primal questions, including what they were willing to die for. It's the second volume in a projected trilogy, knock wood, about our revolution, which started 250 years ago with a spatter of gunfire on Lexington Green in rural Massachusetts that left 8 Americans dead, 10 wounded. And then over the next 8 years, it metastasized from an obscure squabble over taxes and trade policy and self-rule into both a civil war of great fury and a global conflict fought on 4 continents and the 7 seas. So this book picks up where I left off in Volume 1, The British Are Coming, in the spring of 1777. We'd been at war with the British for 2 years, from those first gunshots at Lexington, through Bunker Hill, the loss of New York, the burning of American towns like Charlestown near Boston, Falmouth in Maine, Norfolk in Southern Virginia. The Continental Army has been chased across New Jersey into Pennsylvania, where General Washington is so discouraged that he writes his brother, "I think the game is pretty near up." And in desperation, and he is desperate, on Christmas night, 1776, famously he attacks and destroys the German garrison in Trenton. And a week later, he wins another victory by destroying the British garrison at Princeton. And the army and the cause survived to fight again. So the fate of the day opens not in New Jersey, but in France, at Versailles, with the king, Louis XVI, and his glamorous spendthrift Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette, known around the French court as Madame Deficit. Because the only way the Americans are going to defeat the British Empire and the Royal Navy, the greatest navy the world has ever seen, is to persuade France, a Roman Catholic absolute monarchy, to form an alliance with rebellious Protestant wannabe Republicans determined to wage insurrection against their lawful monarch. It's a heavy lift diplomatically. And the fellow responsible for convincing the French that this is really in their best interest is a septuagenarian named Benjamin Franklin,
who has arrived in France in December 1776, and, as we learn in the prologue of this book, has enlisted a spindly 19-year-old redhead, one of the richest boys in France, named Gilbert de Moitié. You know him better as the Marquis de Lafayette. And Gilbert is about to sail secretly against the king's orders. The king has told him not to leave France, but he's bought a ship and he's going to sail with some boon companions to America because he's been given a major general's commission in the Continental Army despite having very little military experience. You can't make this up. And in the second volume, we see the Americans lose more than they win at Fort Ticonderoga, Brandywine, Germantown, Philadelphia, Newport, Savannah. Esopus, New York is burned, another town that's burned. Fairfield and Norwalk and Connecticut are burned. Suffolk and Virginia is burned. The British are very good at burning towns. But the rebels managed to hold strong just enough at places like Monmouth in northern New Jersey, at Bennington, in the two battles at Saratoga in New York, to again keep the army and the cause intact. They have enough scrappy, indomitable fighters like Benedict Arnold, Daniel Morgan, John Paul Jones, the irascible, brawling immigrant Scottish sea dog, to keep hope and the cause alive. So this volume draws to a close, spoiler alert, with catastrophe in Charleston in May 1780, when the British trap and then capture an entire American army, 5,000 men. It's a disaster for the rebel cause. Now you don't have to read the book. Although, in fact, a lot more happens. Some of it good, some of it bad, and some of it simply miraculous. Much about the revolution has been forgotten or distorted. The founders often are either embalmed in reverence or condemned for their manifest flaws. Certainly, 18th century revolutionary rhetoric could be aspirational, if not delusional. The stirring assertion that all men are created equal did not, of course, apply to 500,000 enslaved blacks. It's 1 in 5 of all people living in the 13 colonies when those fine words were written in 1776. Nor was it valid for women, American Indians, or indigents. For the 8-year duration of the American Revolution, those who remained loyal to the British Crown, and even skeptics who were straddling the fence because they were uncertain about the wisdom of armed rebellion against their lawful monarch, were subjected frequently to dreadful treatment. Disenfranchisement, confiscation, jail without bond, beatings, exile, and occasionally execution. Partisan belligerence metastasized into civil war, our first civil war. And you all here in East Tennessee know something about civil war and the cleaving of communities. At least 25,000 Americans died for the cause of the revolution, possibly many more. It's a larger proportion of our population to perish in any of our wars other than the Civil War. Conformity, censorship, and zealotry flourished. In a defensive war waged for liberty and to secure basic rights, the Americans promptly invaded Canada in an attempt to win by force of arms what could not be won by blandishment and negotiation, a 14th colony. This is the semi-quincentennial of our invasion of Canada. It did not go well. And to all of you empire builders out there who think that Canada ought to be the 51st state, I invite you to read chapters 5, 8, and 12 of The British Are Coming. The enduring image of a yeoman farmer grabbing his musket, leaving his plow and his furrow to go off on behalf of freedom is mostly mythical. Rabid enthusiasm for the patriot cause faded quickly after 1775, when the ranks at first had been filled with property freeholders and tradesmen, many of whom soon returned to their farms, their shops, their tanneries, to attend to families and businesses they could no longer ignore. Instead, the army increasingly depended on the landless young, the poor, the desperate, sometimes the shiftless. And those ranks included unemployed laborers, apprentices, farmhands, servants, drifters, and recent immigrants, notably Irish Protestants driven to America by crop failures and a collapse of the weaving industry. They needed the income, even if it was only the $6 a month that a private Continental Army earned. States began conscripting troops, sometimes with names drawn from a hat, although they permitted the hiring of substitutes for Continental Army service or the buying of exemptions with a fine. In New Jersey, drafted masters enrolled their slaves or their indentured servants in their stead. Maryland began forcing vagrants into the army. Desertion was such a persistent problem that General Washington warned, "We shall be obliged to detach one half of the army to bring back the other half." Washington himself remains heavily mythified. The man, proverbially incapable of telling a lie, certainly could be disingenuous, notably in his dispatches to Congress after yet another battlefield setback. He at times was moody, self-pitying, with a molten temper. He complained in 1777, "I do not think that any officer since the creation ever had such a variety of difficulties and perplexities to encounter as I have." For much of the Revolution, he was an indifferent tactician, and his generalship proved a medley of miscalculation and misfortune, periodically redeemed with bold aggression and the good luck provided by stumbling enemies, providential fogs, and bullets that barely missed. During Washington's lifetime at Mount Vernon, at least 577 slaves worked his plantation. It's an appalling reminder that much of this country's prosperity was predicated on human bondage. One of those enslaved men said of Washington, "I never see that man laugh to show his face, to show his teeth. He done all his laughing inside." Well, that no doubt reflected a lifetime of dental miseries that kept him tight-lipped. But it was also because, as one of his aides wrote, the weight of the whole war may justly be said to lay upon his shoulders. John Adams, who was wary of what he called the superstitious veneration accorded Washington by many Americans, nevertheless conceded that what Adams called his great manly warlike virtues reassured the public, as did his rectitude and his readiness to sacrifice self-interest for the greater good. And in fact, he embodied the classical virtues cherished by his country: fortitude, prudence, temperance, and the subordination of private advantage to public benefit. As Washington put it, one steady line of conduct for the good of the great whole. Repeatedly refusing to use his power for his own ends, he consciously emulated the Roman republicans he admired, notably Lucius Quintius Cincinnatus, a Roman military leader who saved Rome on the battlefield, but then put away his sword to retire to his farm. Today, the revolution that midwifed the nation seems an ancient, arcane quarrel. But even now, certain truths can be discerned across the centuries. That this nation was born from violence, with bitter discord, part of our birthright. That high-minded leaders worthy of esteem can rise to the occasion with pluck and wisdom and equanimity. And that regardless of the trials bedeviling us in 2025, when national unity is elusive, when partisan rancor seems ever more venomous, we have surmounted greater perils, existential perils throughout our history. The American creation story remains valid, vivid, pertinent, exhilarating. It's a reminder that we're the beneficiaries of an enlightened political heritage handed down to us from that revolutionary generation. And that bequest includes a legacy of personal liberty and strictures on how to divide power and keep it from concentrating in the hands of authoritarians who think primarily of themselves. We cannot allow that to slip away. We cannot allow it to be taken away. We cannot be oblivious to this priceless heritage or the hundreds of thousands who have given their lives to affirm and sustain it over the past 250 years. Time and distance have largely bleached the blood from the revolution, giving it the lusterless, tidy look of a faded lithograph. Yet the war was brutal, relentless, often cruel. While British troops burned many towns, their German allies, the Hessians, were accused of many rapes in central New Jersey and pillaging everywhere. American troops murdered captured Indians allied with the British before flinging their bodies into the Wabash River. Other American soldiers destroyed 40 Native American villages in western New York during a wrathful campaign of retribution. And the sorrow of war wasn't limited to the battlefield. Excruciating pain can be found over and over, far from the sound of gunfire. And I'll give you an example. I've been thinking about it a lot recently. Sergeant Oliver Reed, 31 years old, was a soldier in the 4th Connecticut Regiment. And he was at Valley Forge during that miserable winter of 1777-1778, when more than 2,000 American soldiers died of malnutrition, disease, and very poor living conditions. And Sergeant Reed at Valley Forge got a letter from his wife Betty at home in Pomfret, Connecticut. And she told him that 3 of their 4 children, all under the age of 6, had just died of typhus. And she said of their son Chester, who had not yet turned 3, "I never see anybody die in such distress as he did. He had his senses to the last. And the last words he said was, 'I'm a-coming, I'm a-coming, I'm a-coming.'" Well, we can hardly begin to imagine the anguish that letter caused Sergeant Reed, but he too was a-coming, and in a year he would be dead. And his wife Betty, now a widow with 1 surviving child, wrote to her in-laws when she got news of his death, "Bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh is no more, but is congregated with the dead." That's what war is like. That's what war is always like. And that's what the revolution is like. So let's take a moment to consider the other George, George III, our last king. He wasn't a tyrant, as the Declaration of Independence accuses him of being, or a royal brute, as the polemicist Thomas Paine alleges in Common Sense, the essay that he published in January 1776. He wasn't the sinister ninny who prances across the stage every night in Hamilton, singing "You'll Be Back." George was instead a diligent, dutiful constitutional monarch, a patriot king. Shaped by the Enlightenment, he promoted both the arts and the sciences. He sponsored the Royal Academy's founding in 1768. He amassed the 65,000 books that would form the basis of the Royal Library, of the British Library, building an observatory at Richmond Palace, where he personally took measurements of the transit of Venus across the sun in 1769 to help gauge the size of the solar system. He played the flute, the harpsichord, the piano, the organ. He also wrote treatises on crop rotation under the improbable pen name Ralph Robinson for the periodical Annals of Agriculture. George was always intrigued by how things are made, from buttons and pins to canals and naval warships. He collected 2,000 clocks and watches and chronometers, barometers, other gadgets, some of which he disassembled to study their innards. A decade ago, Queen Elizabeth II, still alive then, opened up to outside scrutiny the Georgian papers, which she owned as part of a project to catalog and digitize the papers of all four Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are 500,000 pages, most of them from the reign of King George III, who was king for almost 60 years, and most of them previously unpublished. And I was among the first allowed in to take a look for a whole month at Windsor Castle, just west of London, where the papers are stored. And every morning I would show my badge at the Henry VIII gate to get into the castle, and again at the Norman gate, and I would climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower, begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers, in gorgeous, oversized red binders. George was his own secretary until late in life when he began to go blind, and he not only wrote most of his correspondence himself, he made the copies himself. And as you paw through these pages, there's a tactile sense of being in his presence. Among other things, he's a great list maker of lists of British garrisons abroad from 1764 to 1775, of Royal Navy vessels under construction in various shipyards, of all his regiments in America with the number of officers, musicians, and rank and file for each tabulated with his arithmetic scratchings in the margin as he does his sums. George copied out his own recipes for cough syrup: rosemary, rice, vinegar, brown sugar, all boiled in silver. Insecticide: wormwood, vinegar, lime, swine's fat, quicksilver. He'd married an obscure drab German princess, Charlotte, as in Charlottesville, Virginia, Charlotte, North Carolina. She learned to play God Save the King on the harpsichord during her voyage from England to Germany. They married 6 hours after they met, and he had the marriage bedroom decorated with 700 yards of blue damask and large basins of goldfish. Because nothing says I love you like a bowl of goldfish. He called her the queen of my heart, and she shared his piety, as well as his affection for the composer Handel, country dances, and the theater. And he indulged her fondness for jewelry, dogs, and snuff. The happy union proved fertile. She produced children with lunar regularity, eventually to number 15. And we see in his personal correspondence that George was a caring father. He was invested in the rearing of his kids. And through all this, he's trying to figure out the proper course for the British Empire, for the monarchy, and for his people. It's easy enough to dislike, but impossible, I find, to simply detest and dismiss as a reactionary autocrat. However, he could be ruthless, self-righteous, and so mulish that he threatened abdication unless his government maintained a hard line against American independence. Blows must decide, George declared in 1774. Blows would decide, and the war he chose to wage was brutal, bloody, and often savage. Unlike modern war, killing in the 18th century was usually intimate, very close range. That's partly because the bayonet was necessary as the primary killing instrument in many fights, because 18th century muskets were increasingly inaccurate beyond 80 yards and almost hopeless beyond 100 yards. Scholars have calculated that in the fights at Lexington, Concord, and the British retreat to Boston on the first day, of the Revolution, April 19, 1775, the Americans fired about 75,000 rounds, but only one bullet in every 300 actually hit a redcoat. The shot heard around the world probably missed. On the other hand, massed musket fire, clusters of men firing in volleys, sending swarms of 1 ounce lead slugs flying downrange at about 1,000 feet a second, that could be devastating. 1 ounce lead bullet could stop literally a charging bull. By the way, later studies by the British Army demonstrated that soldiers wearing conspicuous red uniforms were more than twice as likely to be shot in combat as those dressed in muted blues and grays. Duh. American marksmen, particularly those few with rifles, which were more accurate than muskets but harder to load and couldn't carry a bayonet, learned to target the brightest of the redcoats, those that were almost vermilion in hue, because they were usually worn by officers who could afford the more expensive dyes to make those coats pop. In the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775, and we just celebrated the semi-quincentennial of Bunker Hill about a week ago, the British captured roughly a square mile of rebel-held territory at a cost of over 1,000 casualties, including 226 British dead. Now, a dry rot had undermined the King's cause virtually from those first shots at Lexington. Britain's war effort leaned on several strategic misconceptions in underestimating, for example, rebel resolve against British firepower, and overestimating the depth of loyalist support across the colonies, those who remained loyal to the crown. Protecting and arming loyalists so that the good Americans, the loyalists, could help to subjugate the bad Americans, the rebels, was critical if the insurgency was to be crushed. Yet recent scholarship has calculated that no more than 20% of the 2 million white Americans living in America during the Revolution were steadfast loyalists. That was never enough to tip the scales during the Revolution. Loyalists lacked national leaders, they lacked effective propaganda, and they lacked self-sufficiency without massive British support. None of the 13 states remained under Loyalist control after 1775, notwithstanding pockets of loyal strength along the western frontier from New York to Georgia and the maritime regions of the Middle States. Despite few rebel military victories, virtually all levers of power, from municipal committees of safety to state governments and the National Congress, remained under insurrectionist control. British commanders also underestimated the difficulty of feeding tens of thousands of British and German soldiers in North America, as well as the 4,000 horses that consumed 20,000 tons of hay and oats a year. That's a lot of hay and oats. Because foraging expeditions by the British often faced ambush by aroused rebels, nearly all supplies, from flour and salt meat, fodder, to candles, musket balls, opium, had to be shipped from England or Ireland across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail. For 8 years, as it turned out. The British Commissary General, the guy who was in charge of supplies in occupied Philadelphia, wrote to his masters in London in late 1777, "We can expect no supplies or assistance from this country. We cannot with safety go 100 yards beyond our lines without a large escort." And by large, he meant 3,000 to 5,000 soldiers. That's a huge patrol to try and gather food. And when another 950 horses were shipped from Britain to New York, so the King's Army could move its supply wagons and its artillery carriages, 412 of those 950 horses died at sea during the voyage. The predominant sound of the British military along the seaboard was the splash of dead horses being hoisted out of the hold and thrown overboard. Thousands of horses. Similar difficulties plagued the British for years. Well, George III and his ministers, moreover, believed that allowing the American colonies to detach themselves from the First British Empire, which had been created with Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as we call it in 1763, that independence would encourage insurrections in Canada, Ireland, the Sugar Islands in the West Indies, where the real money was, India. Dominoes would topple, pushing Britain into what King George called a state of inferiority, and consequently falling into a very low class among the European states. Now, that premise was disputed by the likes of Adam Smith, political economist, Scottish political economist, whose monumental The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, and that premise was ruinously wrong. Yet it underpinned the king's determination to wage war for 8 years at an estimated cost of 128 million British pounds sterling. It's equivalent to about $25 billion today. More than 30,000 British and German casualties, the eventual reduction of the British Empire by 500,000 square miles. Against such intransigence, an indomitable American persistence survived from season to season through the war. Not in every patriot heart, and not without despair, but in enough hearts and with enough hope to fight on. The Fate of the Day, the title of this new book, is a phrase that recurs through the Revolution. I quote it a couple of times, including in Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton's description of Washington. Hamilton was an aide to Washington during the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778, when things initially looked very grim for the Americans. Hamilton wrote, "I never saw the general to such advantage. By his own good sense and fortitude, he turned the fate of the day." And the phrase implies destiny, contingency, events that may or may not be beyond the influence of human agency. During the dreary winter of 1778-79, when the Continental Army was bivouacked across northern New Jersey, Washington and his officers organized a homely celebration to commemorate the first anniversary of France joining the American cause. It's an alliance that made victory eventually possible. Without the French, we don't win. And at this celebration, 13 cannons fired a salute, an army band played, and the guests wandered through 13 arches with illuminated paintings depicting scenes from the war so far. Those first shots at Lexington, the stunning capture of a British army at Saratoga in 1777, the burning of Falmouth, Norfolk, and other towns. A final arch imagined what was described as a rising empire, a future peaceable America. Her rivers covered with merchant ships, canoe canals traversing the land. This is why they fought, suffered, and died. They saw peace and prosperity, a land stretching from sea to shining sea. They saw us. In 1790, Benjamin Franklin's whose service to the cause included that duty in France as the country's first and greatest diplomat, died at the age of 84 in Philadelphia. But a few months before he passed, he wrote in a letter to a friend one of the lines for which he's best remembered. "Our new Constitution is now established. Everything seems to promise it will be durable. But in this world, nothing is certain except death and taxes." What he's telling us virtually from the grave is that there's work to be done. The dream endures, but so does the struggle. America is predicated on an idea that all of us are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That should act as a pole star, providing true north, and telling us what it is we think we can do as a people. The perpetual challenge of the American experiment is to draw on these aspirational ideals, to make them our own, to hand them off to our children and our grandchildren, and to use that as a propulsion system for being the nation that those forebears thought we could become. Thanks again for having me with you today in Knoxville. Thank you.
And I'm going to roll around. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll make sure that you have the opportunity to be heard as best I can. And get around to you right quick.
Actually, I'll repeat the question if you'll just talk loud enough for me to hear it.
It's kind of a long question.
It's a long question? Okay.
You
have to hold it close to your mouth. So.
Wanting to ask you for a little insight on my ancestor, third great-grandfather who came from Northern Neck, and as a 17-year-old enlisted in the 14th Virginia Regiment. He was, unfortunately, in some of the battles you mentioned early, Brandywine, Germantown, where he was shot in the leg and captured for 11 months. Also Charleston. But the thing that's always intrigued me, I was hoping you might provide some insight, is when he enlisted as a 17-year-old in 1777, he was given the rank of sergeant. And I've never been able to understand why.
Well, I can't speak to him, obviously. But typically when companies were formed and companies became consolidated into regiments, the regiments formed the army, the leaders were elected. And they were elected on the basis of their buddies voting for them, or because they were recognized to have capabilities. Perhaps some of them 17-year-old unlikely, but perhaps some of them, certainly the officers, had experience in the French and Indian War. So we see many of the higher-ranking officers in the American Revolution have combat experience fighting the French in the 7 Years' War, as it's known in Europe, or the French and Indian Wars, as we call them. So if he was elected sergeant, or if he was chosen as a sergeant, it's probably because his comrades from Northern Neck saw in him something that they appreciated and wanted him to be part of the leadership of the unit.
Thanks very much for being here today. I wanted to, first of all, commend you on, you've heard you mention it 2 or 3 times tonight about this being a civil war. Because I think a lot of times people start to assume it was us versus the British and just kind of gloss over. I think 20% was the number you used. I think that's important to keep in mind. The other thing is, I just want to say I appreciate your coverage in the book of what was going on in London at the time, the politics there, and the World War concept of it. Because again, it's something I had never really focused on. But the question is, I think we all come to our study of history with certain biases, whether it's something we learned or we took for granted or whatever. I'm just wondering, in your study of the American Revolution, is there something you stumbled across that really surprised you, that was sort of like different from what you had assumed the reality would be?
Well, one of the pleasures of doing what I do is I'm surprised every day. The mystery of the next unopened archival box is one of the things that gets me up in the morning. And, I spent 15 years writing about the American liberation of Europe in World War II, and, that is full of surprises. And the American Revolution is no different. I'm perpetually surprised by the British and by what it is they thought they were doing and why they did it, why they labored as long and as hard as they did to keep fighting, particularly after the war. The British want a short, quick war, partly because they are deeply in debt from the last war, the 7 Years' War. And that's one of the reasons they try to tax the colonists. And the level of taxation is very small. The average American taxpayer is paying the crown about 1/50th of what his counterpart in Britain is paying, but it's done without the consent of the taxed. I live in the District of Columbia, and my license plate says taxation without representation, because I have no representative in Congress. It pisses me off. You wouldn't like it, I don't like it, they didn't like it. And it wasn't the taxation in and of itself, it was that they had no voice in it. And they had no voice, basically, in their destiny. Trying to understand why the British didn't understand that is part of the thing that I'm pursuing perpetually. It's important to know that George III not only never came to America, he never left southern England. He never went to Ireland. He never went to Scotland. He's king for almost 60 years. He never went to Scotland, much less the continent, much less North America. And most of his ministers were similarly constrained in their worldview. They're worldly men, they're very sophisticated, but they have no idea what's going on here. They don't recognize that for more than 100 years, British colonists in America have been largely left alone. And they have in New England and the other original colonies have developed their own systems of government. They've become accustomed to controlling their lives. And when the British, as part of an effort to recoup some of the money that they've spent on the 7 Years' War, and they send regiments to America, partly to keep the Americans and the Indians apart initially. It's not right here in this part of Tennessee, but it's on the frontier. And then some of those troops are stationed in Boston because they're really surly and obnoxious in Massachusetts. And you wouldn't like it if foreign troops were stationed here. And the British don't really understand the grievances that are building up, to the point where you're willing to risk your life, your fortune, your sacred honor to oppose it. So trying to understand why the British are doing what they're doing is something that just perpetually surprises me. There are lots of surprises about individuals. Benedict Arnold, best tactical commander on either side the first 2 years of the war, born to lead other men in the dark of night. He is a fantastic fighting son of a bitch. And Washington very much appreciates it. And trying to understand what's going on in his head, why the grievances build up, why the gradual slippage in his moral compass to the point where his name is synonymous with treason. So the individuals are always a mystery. There are some parts of the human heart that are very difficult to penetrate, especially 250 years later.
Another?
When you were here a few years ago, you said you were close to some people.
Put that closer to your mouth, so. Yeah.
When you were here a few years ago, you said you've gotten close to some of the people that you studied for these books, particularly Theodore Roosevelt Jr., I think also Alexander Sandy Patch. Was there anybody in this war that you became particularly enamored with?
Oh, well, that's another joy about doing what I do. I lived with Eisenhower metaphorically for almost 15 years. And over the course of those 15 years, I got to know him quite well as a general and as a man. And the more I was with him, the more I admired him, actually. And I've got the same relationship with Washington now. I've been with Washington metaphorically for 12 years. I think I know him pretty well as a general, as a man. I recognize his foibles. I describe some of them. I could go on and on about his shortcomings. But I also could go on and on about his strengths, his character, his capacity for learning. One of the things that, I'll mention a couple of things that I have not talked about so far. He has a great eye for subordinate talent. That's important in a leader. So he recognizes that this 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller named Henry Knox, you've heard of him, your town's named for him, is going to be the father of American artillery. He recognizes that Nathaniel Greene, a lapsed Quaker anchorsmith from Rhode Island, is going to be second only to Washington as the indispensable man in the Continental Army for 8 years. That's his eye for subordinate talent. He's got Washington like Eisenhower, and there are a lot of similarities between them as generals, even though they're completely different in their backgrounds. He's robust. He never seems to even catch cold for 8 years at a time when tens of thousands are dying of smallpox, dysentery, typhus, typhoid, the many infectious diseases that the 18th century is heir to. He's got, again, and I would say about Eisenhower, he's also very robust despite smoking 4 packs of cigarettes a day at the time of Normandy. Washington, like Eisenhower, is very articulate, orally and in writing. You rarely leave the commanding general's presence without knowing precisely what it is that he wants you to do. That's really important in any commander. Seeing this play out, and the last thing I'll say about Washington is he's got a capacity to get bigger as the burdens get bigger. This isn't given to every human being, right? Most of us are at some point crushed under the weight of the responsibilities that we take on. Washington, when he first shows up to take command of the Continental Army, and he's campaigned for the job by showing up in the Second Continental Congress wearing his uniform from the French and Indian War, hint, hint. And he's given command of the Second Continental Army. He's the obvious choice. He's only got 5 years of military experience as a colonel in the Virginia militia during the French and Indian War, always under superior British command. He's been out of uniform for 16 years. We can only imagine that, trying to button it when he shows up at Continental Congress in 1775. And there's a lot he doesn't know. One of the things he doesn't understand when he arrives in Cambridge, outside of Boston, in early July 1775, he's got all those slaves back in Mount Vernon taking care of business for him when he's away. These men, mostly New England militiamen, have given up their farms, their families, their shops. They've made great sacrifices to be at his side, to serve with him in a common cause. He doesn't get that at first. He talks privately about dirty New Englanders. He has nothing good to say about the junior officers. He's got to learn, and he does learn, because he's got a capacity for learning and growth, that he's got to learn that it's incumbent on him to become a successful war-winning general. He's got to effect the mystical bond between leader and led. That's important in any organization. But it's really vital in a military organization during a war. He's got to convey to these men, and they're mostly almost all men, that he understands the sacrifice that they're making to be with him. And they've got to feel in their bones that he understands that. And that's one of the things that makes him ultimately successful. He makes that transition into a general for whom men will die for. And that's pretty rare. So, I dwell on Washington because he's the long pole in the tent. He is proverbially an indispensable man, and he is the indispensable man.
we'll have time for two more here before we'll start to get to some book signing.
Good evening. Why do you think that General Lord Howe never exhibited that killer instinct?
General
Howe.
General Howe.
William Howe.
Yeah.
Time and again, he had Washington and the Continentals on the ropes, and time and again, he allowed them to escape, for the revolution to continue.
Yeah.
Any insight as to why he never closed the deal?
Yeah, General William Howe became the commanding general of British forces while they were still in Boston in 1775-76. And General Howe had a distinguished career. He's relatively young. He's relatively junior among British generals. He had covered himself in glory during the 7 Years' War. He had led the troops ascending the cliffs below the heights to the heights of Plains of Abraham, scaling up from the St. Lawrence River when the French were defeated at Quebec. He didn't let the Americans escape. They escaped. It wasn't because he let them. There was a lot of supposition in London. Howe had, particularly as the war dragged on and it wasn't ended as quickly as everyone in Britain had hoped, there was supposition that he had sympathies for the Americans, sort of hidden sympathies. There were three Howe brothers. George, the oldest, had been killed by the French near Fort Ticonderoga in the 7 Years' War. He was considered the best soldier in the British Army, died young. And he was so esteemed by the Americans, he was killed in 1758, I'm guessing thereabouts. So esteemed by the Americans that the colony of Massachusetts paid for a memorial to be built to him in Westminster Abbey. And there was and the other brother was Richard, who became Lord Howe when George died. And Richard Howe was the admiral commanding the Royal Navy in North American waters, one of the greatest fighting admirals in British naval history. He's a very formidable adversary. There was supposition that the two Howe brothers, particularly William, were soft on the Americans because they'd been nice when George was killed. That's just nonsense. There are towns being burned by this guy. There are women being raped by his men. There are a lot of people being killed. There are farms being burned, all under his command. Why didn't he clinch the deal? He wins a signal victory at the Battle of Long Island, New York, in late August 1776, the largest battle of the American Revolution, just in terms of the number of men involved in that battle. Washington is outgeneraled completely. Washington doesn't go out and look at the ground, doesn't recognize that he's vulnerable in his left flank, and the British outflank him by a march during the night, and Washington wakes up and they're behind him. That is never good. And so Howe wins the Battle of Long Island, drives the Americans back, they fall back into Brooklyn, and they escape by the skin of Washington's false teeth. By slipping across the East River in that one of those providential fogs. Washington has organized enough boats to carry his army away. The British at dawn look, and the last of the boats is going across the East River to Manhattan. Howe didn't let them get away. They got away. He made the decision not to launch a frontal attack against Brooklyn because it would have been very, very costly to him. The Americans were entrenched. They had a lot of cannons. He could not afford heavy losses. You couldn't replace men who were killed or badly wounded easily. In some cases, you couldn't replace them at all. He had to be very mindful of casualties. And he's very mindful of casualties throughout. So I'm more sympathetic to William Howe. He's not a particularly great general. He had opportunities, you're right. But the opportunities were not exploited because he let them get away. He was not Napoleon. And he was not able to defeat a general who turned out in the long run to be better than he was in George Washington.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Rick again for his speech. Folks that have brought your books here, we'll do a book signing. Here's the table over here. You can assemble and form a line on that side of the sanctuary. And Rick, I think we have some pins and water already available for you. And you can flex your fingers and wrists and be ready to do this. Once again, thank you all for being here tonight.